Hello, welcome to today's Research Wales Innovation Fund interview. I am Eve Oliver, and today we're going to be discussing the newly funded study, Activate. So this is a study which evaluates a smartphone app aimed to reduce harmful gambling and PTSD symptoms in veterans. Activate is a collaboration between Swansea University, Combat Stress, and King's Centre for Military Health Research, King's College London. We are joined by Professor Simon Dymond, Director of the GREAT Network at Swansea University. Hello, Simon.
Hi, Eve.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what the GREAT Network is and how it led to this Activate study?
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity to chat with you about our research. The GREAT Network is a Health and Care Research Wales funded infrastructure centre where we seek to become the clearinghouse or a centre for excellence for all things gambling related harm, in particular focused in Wales. So we're multi-stakeholder led, we've got excellent links to beneficiaries and policymakers, and we're interested in developing and expanding the evidence base as regards markers of and treatments for gambling related harm.
That sounds really, really interesting work. And what are the motivations for this study? Why did it come about?
This particular study, which is now being called the Activate study, has an interesting history. It was initially funded through a RWIF Research Wales Infrastructure Fund internal pot of money, and the outcomes of that have led to this successful award from the Office for Veterans Affairs to set up the Activate study. So just to give you a brief overview of that kind of history, the RWIF fund allowed us to scope the literature, to review the literature, to find out what existing treatments were already out there for veterans who experience both post-traumatic stress disorder, which is relatively common, and also experience gambling harm or harmful gambling. We don't know enough about either of those problems, to be honest, in veterans, but when they coalesce, when they're co-present or coexisting, it can represent a particularly unique set of challenges. So we scoped the literature on that, and from our findings, we led to the successful bid for award from the Office for Veterans Affairs.
Oh, congratulations on that. And where did the motivation come? What drove you to look into this?
We have a particular focus here in Swansea on understanding markers for gambling-related harm amongst vulnerable populations. And veterans, armed forces veterans, are particularly vulnerable to gambling-related harm. We've done some of the first prevalence surveys amongst the UK Armed Forces veterans community. There's growing evidence base across the world, but we've contributed to that with our UK data. When veterans leave the forces, they are suddenly having to readjust to their a life of not having to follow orders of things and decisions not being no longer made for them or taken for them. And there's often a financial risk, a financial challenge. There's a lack of social support or a change of social support often. So it can place people at risk for developing a gambling problem. So some of our work is aimed at identifying when these gambling problems begin and how best we can support veterans once they've left the forces.
And why did you feel an app would be the best way to communicate and connect with veterans who have left?
The wonderful thing about apps that we all carry around every day on our mobile phones is the convenience. You can access it at any time of the day, whenever you want. You can tap in and log on and enter any relevant information that may be necessary at the time. They're very accessible, they're low cost, they're convenient, and some of the challenges that people encounter as regards seeking treatment for gambling can be overcome using an app. So for instance, people who seek help for a gambling problem are often dealing with a lot of shame. It's still a very stigmatizing condition, but an app allows you to circumvent that and while still remaining anonymous and having access to confidential sources of support.
That makes sense. And your study mentions how acceptance and commitment therapy can help improve PTSD and GD outcomes. Can you tell us a bit more how you got to this?
This particular study, which is now being called the Activate study has an interesting history. It was initially funded through a RWIF, Research Wales Infrastructure Fund, internal pot of money, and the outcomes of that have led to this successful award from the Office for Veterans Affairs to set up the Activate study. So just to give you a brief overview of that kind of history, the RWIF fund allowed us to scope literature, to review the literature, to find out what existing treatments were already out there for veterans who experience both post-traumatic stress disorder, which is relatively common, and also experience gambling harm or harmful gambling. We don't know enough about either of those problems, to be honest, in veterans, but when they coalesce, when they're co-present or coexisting, it can represent a particularly unique set of challenges. So we scoped the literature on that, and from our findings, we led to the successful bid for award from the Office for Veterans Affairs.
Oh, congratulations on that. And where did the motivation come? What drove you to look into this?
We have a particular focus here in Swansea on understanding markers for gambling-related harm amongst vulnerable populations. And veterans, armed forces veterans, are particularly vulnerable to gambling-related harm. We've done some of the first prevalence surveys amongst the UK Armed Forces veterans community. There's growing evidence base across the world, but we've contributed to that with our UK data. When veterans leave the forces, they are suddenly having to readjust to their a life of not having to follow orders, of things and decisions not being no longer made for them or taken for them. And there's often a financial risk, a financial challenge. There's a lack of social support or a change of social support often. So it can place people at risk for developing a gambling problem. So some of our work is aimed at identifying when these gambling problems begin and how best we can support veterans once they've left the forces.
And why did you feel an app would be the best way to communicate and connect with veterans who have left?
The wonderful thing about apps that we all carry around every day on our mobile phones is the convenience. You can access it at any time of the day, whenever you want. You can tap in and log on and enter any relevant information that may be necessary at the time. They're very accessible, they're low cost, they're convenient, and some of the challenges that people encounter as regards seeking treatment for gambling can be overcome using an app. So for instance, people who seek help for a gambling problem are often dealing with a lot of shame. It's still a very stigmatizing condition, but an app allows you to circumvent that and while still remaining anonymous and having access to confidential sources of support.
Your study mentions how acceptance and commitment therapy can help improve PTSD and GD outcomes. Can you tell us a bit more how you got to this and why your information led to this result?
Mm-hmm. The emphasis on ACT in particular, acceptance and commitment therapy, is often called ACT. It's a particularly unique psychotherapy and one we're very, very excited about incorporating within this app development. ACT effectively is a form of psychotherapy. It's considered a third wave form of behavioral psychotherapy, and it has a particularly unique perspective on human suffering, a particularly unique perspective on some of the difficulties that us humans get into that we struggle with on a day-to-day basis. And if I can put it simply, it effectively says that we need to stop the struggle with trying to manage or control or limit or distract ourselves from unpleasant experiences. And it's that struggle that gets us into greater difficulty. So ACT looks at awareness, it looks at acceptance of the present moment, it looks at identifying your values and what it is that you seek to work towards, and kind of letting go of the rope, stopping the struggle with unpleasant thoughts, with traumatic reminders, with sort of cravings or urges to gamble, for instance, and dealing on more positive behavior change strategies. So ACT has been relatively understudied both in the context of veterans and in the context of gambling. So we wanted to synthesize what we knew from the mainstream ACT literature into this app development, which we think can have great potential as an alternative way of understanding and treating both PTSD and gambling harm.
That sounds like incredible work. I mean, to get better understanding, do you mind briefly describing the method that you used?
With this ACT app, which we're still in the stages of development, we did some consensus building work as part of the early RWIF funded work. And we identified from veterans with lived experience of either traumatic experience or gambling harm themselves, what it was that they thought was necessary or important to have within an ACT-based app. And they identified a series of exercises. They felt that more video-based exercises, more individualized exercises tailored to their own needs would be a very, very useful. Something where they can monitor and track their own development, almost sort of graphing their progress through the stages and through their tasks.
So who's working on this study altogether then?
Well, this is, as you mentioned at the start, Eve, this is a collaborative project with colleagues from Combat Stress and the King Centre for Military Health Research at the King's College London. And we have a postdoctoral researcher here, Dr. Catherine Hitch, who is conducting the research based at Swansea. So we're literally just kicking off in the last few months or so. We're still at the scoping stage. We're recruiting veterans from the Combat Stress Network and further afield to participate in the early evaluations and the early assessments of the app-based ACT, or the Activate app as it will come to be known. And we're quite excited about getting started and looking to see if it can help increase what ACT would say is someone's psychological flexibility. So ACT places an awful lot of emphasis on the willingness and the ability to remain open to all experience, both positive and negative. And that's something broadly conceptualized as psychological flexibility. If the ACT app can increase psychological flexibility and undermine or overcome maybe the PTSD symptoms and or the cravings or urges to gamble, then we will be very happy with that outcome, and it will lead to very, very positive, substantive change in the lives of our participants.
And who's collaborated on this piece together? Who have you worked with?
Well, we've worked with King's College London and with Combat Stress, and we also recruited from within the Veterans Lived Experience Network. We sought the input and the expertise of individuals who've experienced either gambling harm or PTSD as a result of military experience, and their insights were invaluable in shaping the project and in shaping the outcomes that we want to achieve. Work like this, it should not and cannot be done without the direct involvement of those with lived experience, and we're very proud to have them as co-developers of this work.
Amazing. And what areas specifically did RWIF, the Research Wales Innovation Fund, help with?
That really helped us scope the literature. We did a systematic review of the literature, which Dr. Catherine Hitch worked on, and we've since published. That allowed us to scope out what had already been done as regards ACT-based apps for veterans, and also what had been done regarding work on gambling harm. So we can synthesize the results of that to make sure that our new app is as reflective as possible of these sort of research gaps that we identified. So we published that systematic review, and we used the findings from that then to justify and to develop a bid, which was one of 22 recently funded by the Minister for Veterans Affairs through the Office of Veterans Affairs as one of the Veterans Health Innovation Fund funded projects.
Brilliant. And you spoke at the second ever Welsh Excessive Gambling Conference, Cardiff Bay in June 2016. How important are these events, and why is it so important to attend them and deliver the work that you've achieved?
It's so important to disseminate what it is that we're doing. This isn't isolated ivory tower kind of based research. This is impactful work that is co-developed, co-produced and co-implemented with the stakeholders, with the communities for whom we're ultimately responsible for. We work in lots of different domains, but that particular conference was particularly enjoyable and representative. There have been several since incarnations of that, and indeed there's been a recent conference in Cardiff last year, which we co-hosted, called the Current Advances in Gambling Research Conference Series. The next one is in London, but last year we had almost 200 people in Cardiff to talk about all things as regards the study of gambling. Embedding what we do within the community of Wales is very, very important for us. It's always reassuring and rewarding to receive the input of media agencies such as the ITV Wales and any interest in our work. It helps spread not only the work that we do, but also for those who may be struggling with particularly a gambling problem. And again, it can be stigmatizing and shameful, but it helps reach those people for whom they may have been worried or concerned about seeking help, and it makes them hopefully realize that help is out there. They're not alone, and that they can make a difference and make a change and move on. And we really hope that by working with media organizations, by spreading the word of what we do, that it can help people who may need that intervention at that time.
And to help people get an even better understanding, do you mind just giving us a brief timeline of the Activate study?
So we're in our first quarter of the Activate study at the moment. It's a 2-year funded project by the Office for Veterans Affairs. Within the next 2 to 3 months, we'll be submitting the ethics approval application, and then we will, on receipt of approval, we'll be recruiting veterans to participate in the pilot development of the app. And then we will develop a more formal evaluation of the app as we go on. So within the next 2 years, so get back in touch and we can give you an update on the findings.
How important is it for wider audiences to be reached, people who don't think that they would benefit from this study, perhaps?
It's very important because you'll inevitably find someone who, when you mention gambling, people will share an experience or an anecdote that they've encountered their own individual gambling experience, or they may know someone for whom they may have concerns maybe about their gambling, and it helps raise awareness of the importance of identifying when something stops becoming fun and help may be needed. Some of the work, some of the studies that have been conducted on the largest samples of veterans, treatment seeking, albeit help seeking, treatment seeking veterans within the general community, and that contributes to the international database, the international series of findings on that particular topic.
Brilliant. So it's the first ever one in the UK, and that's so fantastic that it's happening at Swansea University, and that we're really raising the awareness for important issues like this.
We did this survey a few years ago now, and it's since led to several follow-on studies as well. But that survey was an online survey. A lot of the data collection occurred during times of COVID, so we had to move from in-person to online testing. And we surveyed individuals who had recently left the armed forces, so they constituted or met the definition of being veterans. And we surveyed their demographics, so how long they'd served in the army, where they were living, what their educational status was, and so on, their mental health, their proneness to depression and anxiety, for instance, as well as their gambling experience and their gambling activities. And we found that veterans were up to 10 times in that particular study more likely than a group of people who were age and sex matched to the veterans, so an age and sex match, sort of non-veterans group. The veterans group were up to 10 times more likely to have experience of harmful gambling than members of the general population. We also found that veterans were more likely to gamble because of it was a way of coping. It was something that they found useful and helpful in coping with other things, particularly dealing with trauma and traumatic reminders. So it suggests almost like a vicious circle, a vicious cycle, so that someone is gambling to escape or to avoid the traumatic reminders. The moment you get a traumatic reminder, you start gambling, and the cycle needs to be broken. And something like ACT is very, very useful at stepping outside that circle, stepping outside that vicious cycle, and focusing on what one values. So we're very excited that survey work has kind of led us to this point and to the exciting Activate study.
Obviously, because we're in the 21st century, you've looked into IACT. So what's IACT?
IACT is effectively a form of ACT delivered remotely, delivered electronically. So the most obvious format is through a smartphone-based app. So we've decided to adopt an IACT-based approach for this particular study because, again, it helps reach our target audience conveniently at a low-cost method and quickly.
Brilliant. It's just making something more accessible for people, and that's really great. You can involve more people then, and that's fantastic. What are areas that you'd love to research further?
We were very interested in how ACT can help all forms of gambling harm, not just in those veterans, but with the general population. We think ACT has an awful lot of utility as regards the treatment of gambling harm. So we're very excited to kind of explore some of that work a bit further. A lot of our work at Swansea is focusing on military populations. We're soon to be establishing a centre for military gambling research, which we're very excited about. So we see a lot of our focus being in the armed forces military domain, but we remain focused on trying to develop evidence-based treatment for what can be quite a challenging, significant public health concern. The next study is to commence recruitment to get a representative sample of veterans who have experience of PTSD and/or gambling harm, and to get them to run through the app with us, to give their feedback and to adapt the app as and when, and try to make it as representative of their experience as possible and allow it to be tailored to their own individual difficulties and to monitor it and evaluate it. Yeah. We couldn't have done this without the RWIF funding. It allowed us to do that initial bid development and scoping exercise, which led to the larger external funding award. So yeah, thank you to the RWIF for funding it. Google GREAT Network Wales, or send us an email to great@swansea.ac.uk. If you Google the lab, you'll find access to the profiles and the different project websites that we have set up. If you would like to get involved in any of the studies, drop us a line that way. Similarly, if you've got concerns about anyone's gambling problem, then have a look via the GamCare or National Gambling Treatment Network website to find available local sources of support.